Hello and welcome to you all and our Australian colleagues, Eddie Bartnik, Kirsten Deane, John Walsh, Sam Bennett and Bruce Bonyhady and all our listeners. My name is Clenton Farquharson and I'm the chair of Think Local at Personal. It's my privilege and pleasure on behalf of Think Local at Personal to welcome you today to the first in our series of 3 webinars which are focusing on Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme. This is not a dry topic for me. We have been talking about how we pay for social care for many years. What interests me is that not only that Australia has managed this for working age adults, but the reform has linked the money with personalised approach to care and support. Over here, despite the Care Act, we have too few people experiencing too little personalisation. We need to fix this as part of any reform. What is important to me as chair of Think Local at Personal and as a disabled person with lived experience of care and support is how the National Disability Insurance Scheme won public support and captured the political imagination that made such a far-reaching reform possible. We cannot lift and shift the Australian experience. It's too big and far away anyway. But I am confident there are some big signposts for us to learn from. So I'd like to introduce our host, Eddie Bartnik. Eddie has extensive experience of the disability sector in Australia and overseas. He has a deep understanding of the environment that led up to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, where he was strategic advisor for 5 years. And today, and here I need to take a big breath, he's the international lead and chair of the sponsoring country's leadership group of International Initiative for Disability Leadership. I first met Eddie 2 years ago in Thurrock, then last year in Derby, where we both spoke at the local area coordination network for England and Wales, and in June at the national online event hosted by Eddie on behalf of the Australian International Initiative for Disability Leadership. Warm welcome, Eddie, and it's great to share knowledge and experience between our 2 countries.
Hello everybody, and thanks Clinton and to TLAP for hosting this joint event featuring some of the outstanding national leaders who helped create and design the groundbreaking National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia. I still can't believe we've got all these wonderful speakers in the one place at the right time, so very excited about this and looking forward to this session. As co-host of this event with TLAP, the International Initiative for Disability Leadership, which we affectionately call IIDL, is an international membership organisation which focuses on collective and inclusive leadership development, which enables the rapid dissemination of policy, research, practice and resources across our 8 member countries. We were very excited when England joined in 2018, and they're making a great contribution through the Department of Health and Social Care and also Think Local Act Personal. Countries can join as members and leaders can participate for free and pay only for their travel. And so some of our key activities include international leadership exchanges and network meetings every 18 to 24 months, which rotate between member countries, with the next one being in New Zealand in 2022. We have country events like this. We also have a bi-monthly e-newsletter featuring latest reports and resources. And then we've got collaborative virtual networks that focus on a specific topic. Now, the key thing about IIDL is it allows for a more speedy and candid sharing of experiences and progress through a trusted network of established relationships. And that's what makes it so unique. And in our discussions with TLAP and also with David Nuttall from the Department of Health and Social Care, we understand there's significant interest in the NDIS in England, and it can be hard for people to get a more holistic picture of the scheme and to reconcile the various reports that you might read. Now, I just want to clarify some of the language. So we have a National Disability Insurance Scheme, which we'll call the NDIS, and then we have the NDIA, which is the National Disability Insurance Agency. So we agreed that a series of 3 webinars would be a good way to go. The first one focusing on the creation and initial design of the scheme. The second one focusing on how the scheme works and is evolving in practical detail. And the third focusing on the sustainability and data aspects of the scheme, that is the evidence of the scheme. These 3 webinars will be in a sequence, but people can join the second and third ones and with a bit of getting up to speed from the previous sessions. So there's way too much to bite off in one session. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to provide some information on the format of the session. So please be aware the session is being recorded so it can be shared more widely. You can post questions which we'll address in the Q&A part of the program. You won't be able to see others' questions and the name you registered with will appear in your question. And if you want to put your organisation into your question, that will also be helpful. We'll have our 3 main speakers in a moment, Bruce Bonyhady, Kirsten Deane and John Walsh, each speaking for 20 minutes, and I'll introduce each. I'll then introduce Dr. Sam Bennett, who will have 5 minutes for some reflective comments. We'll then have a short 5-minute break around 10:15 a.m. But please, we want you to come back because during the break, we'll be collating all the questions. And then the very important second part of the session will be an opportunity to engage with you all and to respond to your questions. And then I'll hand over at the end to Carolyn Speirs, Head of TLAP, to close the session. Now, back to the NDIS. I'm probably aware some of you might know a lot and some might be coming to this sort of quite new. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme is the biggest social policy reform in Australia since Medicare, and internationally the scale of the transformation in Australia is quite unique. The scheme has had a number of stages, including the creation and initial design stage, then a trial stage, a transition stage, and now full scheme development. And the 30th of June 2020 quarterly report describes we now have 100% national coverage of the country with just under 400,000 participants. Satisfaction ratings are around the 80% mark, and it also reports progress on participant and family carer outcomes, the way in which people's lives are improving. So significant transformation has occurred, though it certainly is a work in progress, which we will explore more fully in the coming seminars. So what were the ideas, the evidence and the campaign that created this groundbreaking scheme? We have 3 absolutely outstanding speakers that will take us on this journey, starting with Professor Bruce Bonyhady AM, who was a disability reformer, economist, one of the key architects of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and was the inaugural chair of the National Disability Insurance Agency from 2013 to 2016. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Eddie, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be able to contribute to this important discussion on how collective and inclusive leadership led to the creation and initial design of Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme, or NDIS, and to provide some context to this reform. I've entitled this presentation, Creating the Perfect Disability Storm Through Inclusive Collective Leadership, because it was this collective and inclusive leadership in which the whole was so much more than the sum of the parts, which led to the NDIS. May I therefore especially acknowledge my fellow panel members and fellow leaders, Eddie, John and Kirsten, with whom I've worked very closely on campaigning for, designing and operationalising the NDIS. I'd also like to acknowledge Sam, with whom I'm now collaborating in his role as General Manager Strategic Advice, Research and Inclusion at the National Disability Insurance Agency. The NDIS at 30th June this year, as Eddie has mentioned, was directly supporting nearly 400,000 Australians with disability after 7 years of operation. It's now available in all parts of Australia, and when it is fully operational, it will support around 500,000 participants out of a total Australian population of around 25 million people, or about 2% of the population. Amongst the current participants, more than 175,000 are receiving disability support for the first time. Most of the next 100,000 expected participants will also be people being supported for the first time, implying that more than 1/2 of total participants will be receiving disability supports for the first time in their lives as a result of the NDIS. There are also nearly 15,000 active service providers, more than 3.5 times the number of providers 4 years ago. The scheme's clients include all those Australians who are born with or acquire a disability before the age of 65 and whose disability is permanent and which significantly affects their functional capacity. The NDIS includes people with cognitive, physical, sensory and psychosocial disabilities, as well as early intervention services, especially for children, and eligibility is based on a functional assessment rather than a medical diagnostic approach. All participants receive reasonable and necessary benefits based on their individual needs, which reflect their goals, the sustainability of their informal supports, and functional impairments. The benefits encompass support for activities of daily living, access to the community, therapy services, essential assistive technology, and capacity building consistent with the insurance and investment approach. The NDIS does not include income support for people with disability who cannot work, as this is provided under separate arrangements in Australia. The total cost of the NDIS, once fully operational, will be $22 billion a year, and it means there will be a doubling of expenditure by Australian governments on disability supports and services from around 0.5% to 1% of GDP between 2013 and 2021. This is a very large shift in national resources, and over this period, the NDIS will also account for about 20% of new jobs created in Australia. But this growth in government spending on disability is not the key aspect of the NDIS, which is transformational. What truly makes the NDIS revolutionary is the unique way it brings together 4 key organising and operating principles. First, the NDIS is an insurance scheme. As an insurance scheme, it seeks to minimise lifetime costs and maximise lifetime opportunities. This contrasts with traditional welfare models of support, which do not invest in people with disability and seek to minimise budgetary costs in the short term and not the long term. As an insurance scheme, the NDIS also continually compares forecasts with experience and invests in research to learn and improve long-term outcomes for people with disability, their families and carers. Second, the NDIS is controlled by the individual with a disability and their family. They have the power and they're free to choose. The scheme therefore embraces the shift to consumer-directed and personalised supports that have emerged in a number of countries, but we are implementing this market-based approach on an unprecedented scale. Markets are being harnessed to serve people with disability, and over time, we expect that control and choice will unleash new and powerful market forces, which will lead to much greater efficiency, effectiveness, and innovation. Third, the NDIS recognises that governments alone cannot and should not be responsible for all care, because a quality life and citizenship are based on loving relationships, friendships, and sufficient government funding for an ordinary life. The NDIS will be making a major investment in family and community capacity and inclusion through an approach called local area coordination, with which you're familiar with through Eddie. An approach which already has a long track record of successfully developing local service responses in Australia, and which is being adopted internationally and of course in the UK as part of that. Fourth, the NDIS is building the best whole of population and longitudinal database on disability in the world, with data on functional impairments, not just primary disability, the goals of NDIS participants, funding allocations, expenditures, and outcomes. This data is now being linked to other data sets, including social security, tax, employment, health, education, housing, and justice data through a new enduring national disability data asset. The NDIS is therefore at the centre of the establishment of a unique foundation for world-leading disability research. To build on this foundation, Australian governments are also providing funding to pilot a national disability research partnership. The NDIS is therefore a large and complex reform, and inevitably there are and will continue to be operational and implementation issues. It's why we needed a trial phase. It's why through the last 7 years, the management and governors of the scheme have had to listen, learn, refine, and deliver the scheme. I've always seen the NDIS as a 10-year project, and this remains my assessment of how long it will take for the NDIS to fully achieve its bold vision. My interest in what is now the NDIS began in 2006. I was then the chairman of a large disability organisation, and it was clear that people with disability had large and growing unmet needs for support. The people with disability were not able to maximise their potential or engage fully in work and the community. And while governments had visionary disability plans, there was never the resources to make these goals and aspirations real. However, at that time, the environment for any disability reform, let alone large and transformational change, could not have been less propitious. The disability rights movement had lost impetus since the reforms of the 1980s, and the disability sector had become balkanised as groups were forced to compete against each other for increasingly scarce funding. Australian governments were also totally disinterested in disability reform, and so when the campaign for the NDIS began, it did not have any support or standing with governments or bureaucrats. Yet by 2013, the disability sector would unite, the mandarins of the Commonwealth and state governments would be won over, the support of all governments and all political parties would be secured, and reform would be established. The fact that this outsider of a policy idea was able to fight its way to the front of the national conversation demonstrates the power of individuals to improve public policy and society. Leadership, vision, unity, language, economic evidence, and sustained community engagement were the essential ingredients which led to the NDIS. Leadership is critical to all reforms, and especially large and complex reforms. In the case of the NDIS, visionary and united sector leadership was achieved through the creation of a new peak body, the National Disability and Carer Alliance. The Alliance brings together people with disability, carers and disability service providers in a world-first commitment to shared leadership of the sector. The idea for the Alliance was Rhonda Galbalee's, born out of a lifetime of advocacy on behalf of people with disability, and it remains a world first. Without it, we would not have the NDIS. The NDIS was also a unifying idea. It ended decades of schism within the disability sector because it provides support based on need, in contrast to the cruel lottery of the old system, where support was based on disability type, cause, age, or where people lived. The NDIS became the catalyst for the disability sector not just to unite, but to speak with one voice. Language and a reframing of disability were critical to building public support for the NDIS. The description of the old disability system as broken created a burning bridge for inevitable reform. The emphasis on the word insurance in the name of the NDIS made it relevant to all Australians, not just those with disability, because none of us know when we or our children or grandchildren might acquire or be born with a disability. Meanwhile, the campaign's name, Every Australian Counts, alerted the community that some of Australia's most vulnerable citizens were shut out of mainstream life. Economic evidence and analysis is the basis of public policy development in Australia. With that in mind, the NDIS framed disability primarily as an economic issue, not just a social policy or human rights issue. The Shutout and Disability Investment Group reports in 2009 helped to set the scene. Then in 2010 and 2011, following exhaustive examination and more than 1,100 submissions, the Productivity Commission, Australia's preeminent economic research think tank, concluded that the old disability system was, and I quote, underfunded, inefficient, fragmented, and gives people with disability little choice and no certainty, end of quote. That the economic benefits at the end of the NDIS would far outweigh its costs, and that over time it would add close to 1% to GDP. John Walsh was seconded to the Productivity Commission for that inquiry, and his deep knowledge of disability and actuarial experience were invaluable. I first met John in 2006 because I wanted to know whether he could cost a scheme for all people with severe and profound disabilities. His answer was direct. Of course, he said, once I get the data. During the Productivity Commission inquiry and following its final report, the Every Australian Counts campaign elevated disability from a social and economic issue into a political issue. It engaged with all community sectors, especially those that might have been hostile or sceptical, in order to build their understanding of the economic case and move disability from the margins to the mainstream of public discourse. We were fortunate to recruit Kirsten Deane to the Every Australian Counts campaign, which she has now championed for a decade. Kirsten had been both co-chair and deputy chair of the National People with Disability and Carer Council, the principal advisory body to the Commonwealth Government, and she had personally largely written the Shutout report. She's also the mother of a child with Down syndrome, and so brings to the role lived experience and a passion for disability reform. Every Australian Counts was, and in fact still is, a grassroots and social media campaign which used technology smartly. People with disability told their personal and family stories, stories that were authentic, credible, personal, powerful, and shocking. Their stories resonated, and within 2 years, the campaign had more than 150,000 supporters. Prominent reporting and supportive editorials in key parts of the mainstream media added to community understanding, and very quickly Australians without direct knowledge of disability came to see the NDIS as equitable, decent, and economically rational. This culminated in support from 80% of voters when in May 2013, the Commonwealth Government proposed an increase of 0.5% in the Medicare levy to partially fund the NDIS. In other words, an additional 0.5% on everyone's taxes. Never before or since has a tax increase in Australia been greeted with such strong support. The NDIS was also very fortunate that all of Australia's federal and state political leaders and disability ministers came together to embrace its vision, making support for the NDIS multi-party and national. This led to the enactment of the NDIS Act in 2013 and agreements between the Commonwealth and state and territory governments. This deep and wide commitment was essential because it was clear from the start that the NDIS would take many years to implement. The support of all political parties was therefore a key and enduring success of the Every Australian Counts campaign, as the support of all governments for the NDIS has not wavered. Can I just get a new slide, please? One helpful way I have found to think about the formation of the NDIS is through a policy triangle, which has at its apexes the policy context, content, and process, with actors in the centre of the triangle. All of these components are essential to the policy reform process. In the case of the NDIS, the key context was that before the introduction of the NDIS, disability costs were rising at 7 to 8% per annum. Year by year, this was creating a demographic time bomb, which was simply unaffordable for state governments, which had the primary responsibility for disability expenditures before the introduction of the NDIS. Then in 2010, the establishment of the National Disability and Care Alliance and the Every Australian Counts campaign were community-led game changers. The policy content was provided through the Shutout Report and a report by the Disability Investment Group in 2009, the Productivity Commission report on disability care and support in 2011, and then reports from the NDIS Advisory Group to the Council of Australian Governments in 2012 and 2013. Key processes included the 2020 Summit in 2008, which set out a future vision for Australia, and which was when the NDIS first received any public recognition. Then Australia became a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and the NDIS was referred to the Productivity Commission for study in 2009. And following the Productivity Commission report, the establishment of the Council of Australian Governments NDIS Advisory Group, which embedded people with lived experience of disability in the policy process, were all key parts of the process which led to the NDIS. Several of the key actors are here today, but in addition, I also need to mention the essential roles played by the Honourable Jenny Macklin, who was the Disability Minister from 2007 to 2013. The Honourable Bill Shorten, who commissioned the Disability Investment Group and continues to champion the cause of people with disabilities today, and former Prime Minister, the Honourable Julia Gillard, who committed her government to establishing the NDIS, famously stating, "We will get it done," and she did, making the NDIS one of the signature reforms of her Prime Ministership. We could not have created the NDIS without government support, but governments would never have created the NDIS without the leadership and passion for reform shown by people with disability, their families and carers. The NDIS is therefore, above all, a triumph of hope, inclusion and unity, and demonstrates that ordinary citizens can create the perfect storm for transformational and enduring reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for such an outstanding overview of the big picture. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Kirsten Deane OAM, who is Campaign Director, Every Australian Counts, and has been a powerful amplifier of the voices of hundreds of thousands of people through the campaign that fought for the introduction of the NDIS and won. Every Australian Count continues to engage with Australians with disability and its supporters and campaign for the NDIS to reach its full potential. Welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Eddie. And thank you very much to the organisers, TLAP and what did you say, Eddie? IIDL, for the very kind invitation to be here tonight. I do want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I sit on tonight and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to say that this is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. I wanted to start tonight by telling you a little bit of a secret that I am a history nerd. My family knows it well. I drag them to all kinds of places because I really believe that people who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So what I just wanted to do with the short time that we've got here tonight, my time, in the morning, your time, is to go through a very, very quick ride about the history of the Every Estonian Counts and campaign, and then what I think that we've learnt from that and what you might learn from it with your fight that you're undergoing at the moment. So as Bruce said, the idea for the National Disability Insurance Scheme has actually been around for a while now. In fact, there was a proposal for something a little bit like it floating around in Australia in the 1970s. But as Bruce said, it first came back into public prominence again in 2008. And there was a newly elected Labor government, and they had a summit at Parliament House where they brought together a bunch of people to talk about what the future of the country might look like. And the idea for the NDIS was one of the ideas that came out of that summit. And then we went from that in 2008 to its actual introduction in 2013. Now, 4 years is a really long time if you're a person with a disability or a family member, but it's nothing in public policy terms. It's just a blink of a bureaucrat's eye. So the question is, how did we go from just a really good idea in 2008 to actually doors opening in 2013? And I think there's sort of three, Bruce alluded to it, but there's sort of three key things that you need if you're going to get a big public policy reform up in Australia. You need public support, you need political will, and you need bureaucratic backing. Or if you don't have bureaucratic backing, you at least need bureaucratic neutrality. And so what I'm going to talk about and focus on tonight is the first two, the political will and the public backing. So let's go back to 2008. At the same time that summit was held at Parliament House, Bill Shorten, that Bruce mentioned, became Parliamentary Secretary for Disability. He was a new MP, and I think it would be fair to say that he was a pretty ambitious MP. He was an MP who wanted to go places, and I'm also fairly sure that becoming Parliamentary Secretary for Disability was not his first choice of portfolio. But nevertheless, he rolled up his sleeves and cheerfully admitted that he knew nothing about disability and wanted to learn. So the first thing that he did was he went on a bit of a listening tour around the country, talking to people with disability, talking to families, talking to people who worked in the sector about what kinds of issues they were facing. And he has said many times since that he was absolutely shocked by what he heard on that trip. He was a union man. He was a former union organiser, and so he thought that he had a pretty good handle on what disadvantage looked like in Australia. But he said he was shocked by what he heard and what he saw and what kinds of challenges that people with disability and their families faced every single day in this country. So we didn't have to get him on board and convince him that things needed to change. But he was also pretty shocked at what he saw and the state of the disability sector. Fragmented, disorganised, sometimes openly hostile towards each other. What he heard was 1,000 different voices saying 1,000 different things. So basically he issued everybody a challenge. He said that in his experience as a union organiser, the unions that were most successful were those that got their workers to focus on the 90% of things that they agreed upon and agreed to park the 10% of things that they didn't agree on. And so his challenge to the sector was, to people with disability, to families, and to those organisations in the sector, what's your 90%? And can you get organised? And then I will champion it within government. So there were 2 individuals, Bruce Bonyhady and Rhonda Galbally, and 3 organisations who really took Bill at his word. And those organisations were the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, AFDO, they represented people with disability, Carers Australia, that represented families and carers, and National Disability Services, that represented specialist not-for-profit disability service providers. And those three organisations had never worked together before. In fact, it would be fair to say that there was a fair degree of antipathy between all of them. But they started to meet and they formed the National Disability and Carers Alliance. And then they went out and started looking for other individuals and organisations who also wanted to see the NDIS become a reality. And that's how Every Australian Counts was born, if we can have the next slide. So the National Disability, if we could have the next slide, that's great. The Alliance was formed in 2009. And then members of the Alliance went and looked for other individuals and organisations who wanted to work together and form a campaign to make sure that the NDIS went from just being a good idea to reality. And Every Australian Counts was formally launched on Australia Day in 2011. And now, if we can go to the next slide, now we're 10 years down the track, the NDIS feels a little bit inevitable to people in the Australian community. But I can absolutely assure you that back in 2009 and 2010, it did not feel like that. And collectively, I would say that the campaign faced a number of challenges, and I call those challenges the lack. And the first one, and perhaps the most important one, was that there was a lack of understanding and awareness of the issues facing people with disability and their families in this country. Unless you were a person with a disability, or you were a family member, or perhaps a friend, there was very limited community awareness of the kinds of challenges that faced people today. I think that most people thought that Australia was a relatively fair country, had some semblance of a social welfare system, and so somewhere, someone was looking after people with disability, and they didn't really understand the kind of challenges that people faced. The second issue is that if there was limited community awareness of what the problems were, there was even less political will to do anything about it. Disability issues were very, very low on the political totem pole. If I could have the next slide. The NDIS was a big, complicated idea, and it had this funny word, insurance, in it, and nobody really understood what it was. And then if I could have the next slide, not only was it big and was it complicated, it also came with a really hefty price tag. If I could have the next one. And the people that we thought would be able to best explain this really big, complicated, expensive idea were people with disability and their families. And we were fighting for them because they received so little support. So the irony of what we were trying to do was never really lost on us on the campaign, is that we were fighting so that people with disability and their families could get appropriate support and get out and do the things they wanted to do. But here we were giving them something else to do in the meantime. And it was also true that a campaign like this had never been mounted in the disability sector before. And I think the kindest way that I could describe it was that it was a very politically naive sector. We had lots of people with disability and families and organisations who'd never done any kind of political action before. And so that we had to take them on a journey through that. And finally, the final lack that I wanted to talk about, if we could go to the next slide, is lack of money. We didn't have lots of money to run a very big, expensive campaign. We didn't have money for advertising. We didn't have money for fancy pants lobbyists to walk the halls of Parliament House and try and convince politicians to get on our side. We had enough money for a very small campaign team, and that was it. If I could have the next slide. But what we lacked in money, what we did have is people power. We had people with disability and their families. In Australia, there's more than 700,000 people with disability, people who have a significant or severe disability. And if you add to that their families and friends, we had a really large, highly motivated, very passionate group of people who wanted to see change happen. What we needed to do was organise, motivate and resource this incredibly passionate group. So if I could have the next slide. I've been asked a lot of times what the secret to every Australian counts was, and I don't really think it's a secret at all. It's just a really old-fashioned grassroots campaign. We relied on just ordinary grassroots community activism to build public and political support for the NDIS. There was a very small campaign team scattered all, Australia's a big country and we were scattered all across the country. And so all that we really had the ability to do was provide a vehicle, provide a platform, provide opportunities for people with disability and their families to take the running on this campaign. And that's exactly what they did. The success of EAC doesn't belong to the people like me who sat behind the campaign. It really belongs to the people with disability and their families who hit their street, who letterboxed their neighbourhood, who held events, who talked to their local MPs, who talked to media. It is them telling their stories that built all of the political support and public support for the NDIS. We knew that the Australian public would never accept a solution, especially an expensive solution, if they didn't think there was a problem in the first place. And so what we needed people to do, people with disability and their families, just to tell their stories about what their life was like now, but what it could be like with an NDIS. And the most important fact, the most important thing that I think is key to the success of NDIS is that people with disability and their families told their stories. We didn't tell them, and we didn't tell them for them. They told their own stories, and we just provided the vehicle and the opportunity for them to do that. And as Bruce said, as a result, they were authentic and they were genuine and they changed people's minds. So if I could go to the next slide. We started the campaign just with a very simple website and maintaining a petition on a website. And we sent emails out to our supporters and we asked them to do things. And one of the keys to the success of the campaign is that we've always tried to provide people with a range of ways that they could get involved in the campaign. Some things are really easy and some things are really hard and what we call high barrier that take a lot more effort and time to take part in. But we also tried to give people a range of things so they could find some way in, find something that they could do that really grabbed their attention and floated their boat. So if I could go to the next slide. We didn't hold a lot of events, I have to say, mostly because we didn't have very much money. But we did have a few key events, including mass rallies on a couple of occasions. But what we really hit on early in the campaign is a way to have a mass event, but individualize them. Which got greater buy-in from people, but also meant that they frankly cost less. So one of the things that we did in the early days of the campaign was establish something called the Disability, which is basically a morning tea. And the success of that event is that it meant that both individuals and organisations could take part, and we held them all on the same day. And so they were mass events, but they were individualised, and it meant many more people could take part. And in fact, we had hundreds of thousands of people around the country all taking part in these events. If I could have the next slide. One of the other things that I think that we did do very well is that we created a Visit Your Local MP program. We asked people to go and see their local federal member. We gave them some how-to videos, we gave them some resources, we gave them some tools. But we didn't actually ask people to go along and be an expert on the NDIS, particularly since it didn't exist. It was a big, complicated idea and people were very nervous about that. All we really asked people to do was go and see their local MP and talk about their lives, what their life was like now and what it could be like under an NDIS. And then we asked the MP to be a champion. We asked them to champion the idea of the NDIS in Parliament. And so the really powerful message that people with disability and their families delivered to their local MPs was, be a champion, do something that makes a difference. And most MPs, somewhere in their deep, dark past, got into politics because they did want to make a difference. And so what the message was that people with disability and their families delivered to them is, do that, do that. And so what we got people to do is visit their local MPs and then take a photo with them. And we created a gallery. Most MPs had multiple visits and had multiple photos, with a few notable exceptions. And if you want to see the impact of those visits on MPs, you can watch on YouTube as many local members stood to speak in support of the legislation for the NDIS. And you can really see in a very moving way the impact that all of those visits had on those MPs. If I could go to the next slide. So every Australian Council is a little bit unusual in that usually when people campaign for something, they usually go and they win. They usually kind of go, yay, and then just pack up and go home. But because the NDIS was rolling out over such a long period of time, and because it was such a big and complicated reform, everybody wanted to stay really engaged with how it was rolling out. And so everybody stayed really vitally connected and engaged with the actual reform itself. And so it is a little bit unusual in that EAC has now been going for nearly 9 years. And I think that how I would describe the campaign at the moment, and if you will excuse my French, it's kind of in the keep the bastards honest phase. In what it's really trying to do is make sure that the scheme stays true to its original vision, that it keeps the flame alive, and that it really delivers on its promise to people with disability and their families. It also gives people hope. It would be fair to say that the NDIS rollout of the NDIS has been very far from smooth, and there have been plenty of implementation challenges. And so every Australian Council plays a really important role in bringing the experience of people with disability and their families with the scheme to the fore about what they think is working well, what's not, and what they want to see change. So that's the kind of role that we play, even all of these years after the NDIS has been introduced. So if I could go to the last slide. Eddie asked me to reflect on, what do I think the lessons were from running from the campaign for this period? And I've got a few there. And the first is probably get organised and stick to the 90%. A lot of what my work on the campaign was invisible. There was the public facing stuff, the running the websites, the speaking, the making the videos, the going to see the MPs, the events. That was just the iceberg. What I spent a lot of time on the campaign is keeping everybody on the train, keeping everybody organised, keeping everybody focused, keeping everybody united. And so I guess my number one lesson is get organised, stay united, and stay focused, and stick to the 90%. The second one that I would say is that you do need resources. Usually when the community sector mounts a campaign like this, they're usually relying on volunteers and perhaps staff in organisations who generally always have about 5 different jobs that they're always juggling at any one time. One of the keys to success, I think, of every Australian Council is that it was that we relied heavily on volunteers, as I said, to do the work, people with disability and their families. They are the ones who letterboxed. They are the ones who held events. They are the ones who talked to their family and friends. But we did have a very small campaign team who then resourced those volunteers and organised those volunteers and supported those volunteers. And I think that was really key. There was a small campaign team whose only job was to worry about the campaign. The third thing I think is something that Bruce referred to. We were able, through every Australian Council, to make both an economic and a social case for the NDIS. In our particular case, we had the good people like John at the Productivity Commission, the bean counters and the number crunchers, who we were really confident would come up with a strong economic case for the NDIS. And so what our job was and what we did was make sure that we flooded the Productivity Commission inquiry with personal stories so that we put a face to the social cost of not appropriately supporting people with disability. We were confident the Productivity Commission would make the economic case. We wanted to make sure that it also made it the social case and collected the social cost of not supporting people with disability and their families appropriately. And so what you had in the end in the productivity report was this incredibly powerful report that both brought together the economic cost of inaction and the social cost of inaction, and brought those things together and created a very powerful case for change. I think the other two things that I would suggest is that, as Bruce alluded to, we worked very hard to get bipartisan support for the NDIS. Liberal, Labor, Independent, Green, Calathumpian, if you were for the NDIS, then we were for you. And at times, that was a really hard thing to do, because the purpose of the political parties is to get you on their side. And what we had to do through the campaign is bring everybody together and keep everyone on the train. And at times that was very difficult, but it was key to the absolute success of getting the NDIS up. And then the last one is what I think was most important, is that we told stories. The NDIS is an incredibly complex public policy reform, and it's really only policy nerds like me who care about policy in its purest form. Everybody else needs a way in. Everybody else needs a reason to care. And what people with disability and their families did was tell their stories and give people a reason to care. They created the narrative of why there was a problem and why the NDIS was the best solution. And so in the end, I think the real key to success of NDIS was people with disability and their families and their stories. So thanks, Eddie.
Thanks very much, Kirsten. You've left me very, very motivated, even after these 10 years. So congratulations for incredibly sophisticated, authentic grassroots advocacy and finding ways for everybody to tell their story and to build that up into such a powerful force. So, so thank you, Kirsten. And we're going to now move on to the evidence part of the equation. I'd like to introduce Professor John Walsh, AM, who's one of Australia's leading actuaries and who worked on the early Productivity Commission report leading to the NDIS. He was an inaugural member of the NDIA board from 2013 to 2020 and was recently principal member of the Independent Advisory Council until 30th of June 2020. So John, I've been told you'll need to explain what an actuary is, but if you could, on that note, take us off, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie, and hello everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you this morning, Britain time, I guess. If we could have the first slide, please. So I thought it was worth putting a bit of background behind my relevance to this. I've got a bit of an unusual background. As Kirsten said, the first idea of an insurance type model in this world goes way back to the 1970s in Australia and even the 1960s in New Zealand, when Sir Owen Woodhouse introduced a universal no-fault accident compensation scheme for New Zealand. And I managed to break my neck in the early 1970s playing game called rugby league, which those of you in the north of England will have some affinity with, but probably nowhere else in the world other than the eastern coast of Australia. So I knew what it was like to live with a disability, and I managed to become qualified as an actuary. But throughout the whole of my working life, I was interested in the model that Woodhouse had introduced in New Zealand, which is basically around the application of an insurance model to underwrite workers' compensation, motor injury insurance, and other personal injury type insurances. And my job was understanding the data and analysis that's sat behind those type of schemes. So the relevance to disability first emerged in about, for me anyway, in about 2005, when I was approached by a politician called John Della Bosca. At the time was Minister for Disability in New South Wales, one of the states of Australia. and had worked with me previously in the New South Wales Workers' Compensation Scheme. And he said to me, and John was later involved with the Every Australian Counts campaign with Kirsten. So John said, well, you know, we've got this disability model, John, that's out of control. People aren't getting any good support, and the cost is increasing at 7% above inflation every year. Can you have a look at it and see if some of the stuff we do in workers' compensation can be relevant to disability? So in the period around 2005 to 2006, we did some work in New South Wales trying to understand the underlying data behind a disability model, and I'll come to that in a minute, and that fed into the eventual scheme design, I suppose, for the NDIS. Then, as Bruce said, we were co-opted by Bill Shorten onto the Disability Investment Group, and then the Productivity Commission. So my job today is to talk a bit about the design of the scheme. While Kirsten and Bruce were doing all the hard work, I was sitting in an office with a computer, not talking to anyone, and just looking at numbers. So the first slide, please, is first part of the model. This word insurance has caused lots of confusion in Australia. And people say, well, it's not really an insurance scheme because people don't pay premiums and there aren't any policy holders. So let me go through the three tiers of what I regard as insurance. The first tier is the notion of universal coverage. Before the NDIS in Australia, no one with a disability was guaranteed of any support at all. It really came down to rationing. And if the money had run out in one of the states of Australia, and there just wasn't enough money to go around, so we had a situation where there was no universal entitlement. The NDIS changed all that, and so the idea of tier one, the universal coverage, is that there's universal entitlement. And the other part of tier one is that there's a whole commitment by all the governments of Australia, states and territories and the Commonwealth, to improve their mainstream services so that all people with disability, not just those covered by the scheme, have easier access to the community. The second tier, tier two, was about building up the community capability generally, and building up the capacity of all people with a disability to help themselves, if you like, before they even approach the NDIS, to understand how to use the community. And as Bruce and Kirsten have both alluded to, these are big numbers. So in Australia, we estimate there are a total of 5 million people with a disability, or at least an activity limitation, and about 1 million carers, parents, family, and other community supports helping those people. Not all of those are part of the NDIS funded system, but all of those people are part of the tier two community capability idea that needs to go with the NDIS. And I'll come later to the relevance of tier two. Tier three is really where the individualised funding comes in. So of that 5 million people, we're going to have about 500,000 with an individualised support package. And those are the people with either a need for early intervention to help their disability improve, or otherwise with an individual activity limitation, which is regarded as permanent and severe, and so become eligible for the scheme. Tier two is the important one that links between tier one and tier three, because if it wasn't for tier two, there'd be a stampede to try and get into tier three. So it's really important for governments to support the community and the capacity building to allow people with a good life, but without necessarily needing an individualised support package. So that notion of a three-tiered, the first tier you could regard in an insurance framework as that's the entitlement, that's the risk pooling side of it. The second tier, if you like, is a risk management framework. In workers' comp, it would be regarded as occupational health and safety. So you look after the workforce so they don't have an injury. In the context of NDIS, you look after the community capability, the community capacity of people, so they don't need an individualised support package. And then tier 3 is like the claims in an insurance world, where people who fall through the cracks and do have an injury, or in this case, do have a permanent disability, need an individual support package or a claim. I'm going to move on now to the next slide, please. So getting to the technical side of the model, this is all about tier 3, the actual funded package, the 500,000 people and $22 billion a year that Bruce talked about. How do we know it's $22 billion a year? And that's the first question for the insurance model. That sort of idea of a ground up estimate of total cost had never been attempted by any Australian governments. Governments are typically funded within silos of services, and the money that goes to any particular silo depends on how skillful the minister is at banging the table around the cabinet and getting enough money. So the NDIS was different in that when John Delabosca came to me to talk about New South Wales, and then later when Bill Shorten said, well, we want to extend this model to an Australian national scheme, we had to work out what the funding bucket was. And that was the first point about insurance. So it's an actuarial estimate of the expected cost of tier 3 of support. So that exercise had never been undertaken by any Australian governments anyway. How is it insurance? Well, if you think about the NDIA as the insurance company, the NDIA doesn't care where it gets its money from, as long as it gets a big enough bucket of premium to pay its claims. So the NDIA, as the insurer, receives the fund pool estimated by the scheme actuary, and that then is the, if you like, aggregate pool of funding required to deliver the system. So it's a classical, in the world of actuaries, a group life insurance model, where a group sponsor pays the premium on behalf of all of the participants, but it doesn't matter to the insurer where they get their money from. The second part of the model that was a change for Australia was the funding went to the participant rather than in a block grant to providers. Before the NDIS, the services had been provided by typically not-for-profit organisations, which received a block amount of money from state governments, and that would be millions of dollars, and there was no real allocation or hypothecation of what providers were meant to do with that money. They didn't have to give it to any particular number of people. It was up to the providers to, if you like, decide who was most needy or most disabled, to use that awful word. The NDIS changed that to a model where we need to work out how to give funding to individual people. So as well as the estimate of the aggregate pot, the big bucket of money, we need to find a way to fairly dole out the funding to individuals. The now famous catchphrase of the Productivity Commission was underfunded, unfair, fragmented, and inefficient. Doubling the funding and working out what the big aggregate pot was meant to look after the underfunded part of it. Unfair was meant to be looked after by an equitable way of funding individual people. And to do that, we needed to rely on some way of doing an independent assessment of support needs. So that was an actuarial problem of dividing up the whole of the 500,000 population into cells of types of person, if you like. There's a website called People Like Me, and that website looks at, you know, I'm someone with a particular type of disability. I'm 45 years old and I have this level of severity. Well, people like you can do all this sorts of stuff if they've got the right amount of money. So the resource allocation part of the NDIS is to come up with the right amount of money for a person like me. And that idea of an independent assessment is the way to both ensure fairness in the system so that people with relative needs get a relatively fair amount of money, and also to protect the insurance concept of the scheme so that we don't have a stampede for who gets the most money, and so those who are first up get more money and those who are left behind don't get enough. So it's a way of protecting the integrity of the scheme and the stability of the scheme. The other important part of individual allocation of funding is that people were meant to have choice of what that money was used for. So every person has an individual utility function, to use economic lingo. Two different people with an identical disability, given a potential way to live their life, will probably do it two different ways. And so we wanted to make the funding available so that people could choose what direction to take their life in. And that choice is a really important thing. And the concept of self-management, I know it's well known throughout the world, but it was a relatively new concept when the Productivity Commission recommended it in the NDIS. And the last point, of which both Kirsten and Bruce have talked about, is this idea of early investment, early intervention. This is the second gateway into the scheme, if you like, where we look at the lifetime of a person and say, well, if that person could do with a big injection of money up front, either through intense therapy or a different piece of equipment or some other expensive item that will mitigate future costs, that's a worthwhile investment. And so the previously rationed system would have struggled to deal with that, but the NDIS has the funding and the design to make that a possibility. You have the next slide, please. The other part of the insurance model, and in some ways as important as the overall design framework, is how does it run? And the NDIS was recommended to be run by an independent agency, the NDIA, if you like, the insurer, within a prudential insurance governance framework. The NDIS has a scheme actuary who monitors the emerging data of how many people are in the scheme, what do they look like, what are their support needs, how much money do they need, and how much are they spending. So we have a constant monitoring and analysis of data. In order to do that, you need a comprehensive longitudinal database. So prior to the NDIS, Australian databases for government were typically silos of services. It was very difficult to follow an individual between one government department to another, from health, to disability to something else, or even within disability across different service providers. So we didn't actually know what a person's experience was. So the NDIS has a database which is longitudinal, person-centered, and it follows that person through their whole experience and captures their support needs, what services they use, and importantly, what their outcomes are. So we have an outcomes framework which is designed using the best survey materials throughout the world. Everyone in the NDIS is asked for feedback on the outcomes framework on a fairly regular basis. We've got to strike a balance between not bombarding people with survey material, but at the same time understanding what their experience is. So the investment in funding to people has a tangible feedback in allowing governments to see what the outcomes of the scheme are and what the outcomes are for individuals. Second last point is the idea of innovation. So along with more flexible funding and more choice and control for people, we expected that the market would respond with all sorts of innovative solutions. That's been a bit slow coming, I must admit, but we're sort of, and people like Kirsten are on the case the whole time to try and let that evolve. And the last one, I come back to this second tier of investment, which in my mind is critical. That idea of the middle tier, which provides a safety net, an infrastructure, an ecosystem of community that allows everyone to make a contribution to the well-being of their fellows with disabilities, I think is as important as any other part of the scheme. So that's me from Big Land, and I'll be happy to see what questions come out of that lot. I hope it wasn't too complicated. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, John. That was, thank goodness we've got people like you, is all I can say. It's almost incredible that you're able to look at this sort of target population of participants, all different types of disabilities, including mental health related psychosocial disability, different levels of disability, and then all the data around what good support looks like, and to turn that into an overall picture that people would agree to. So, John, that was just incredible work. Okay, just now going to move on, and now I'd like to introduce Dr. Sam Bennett, who's General Manager, Policy Advice and Research within the National Disability Insurance Agency in Australia, where he's responsible for a range of functions, including shaping and implementing significant policy changes to how the scheme will operate. Also, the implementation of the agency's first research and evaluation strategy, and the provision of strategic advice to management and the NDIA board. And so Sam, I was very excited. I knew Sam when he was working in England. He'd worked with TLAP previously, and then was leading the national work on integrated personal commissioning. And we're very excited to have Sam come and work with us with the scheme in Australia. And I think he's ideally placed now to share some reflections and try and interpret some of this experience in the context of the UK. So welcome to you, Sam.
Thanks ever so much, Eddie. That's very kind indeed, and wonderful to be sharing a platform this evening with such wonderful folks. I'm really privileged to be able to be working on this wonderful National Disability Insurance Scheme for the last 2.5 years. It's gone very quickly, and as several have alluded to, we're at a really important stage in the transition of the scheme from a period where we've been bringing on hundreds of thousands of participants to now starting to refocus on how we really realise some of the underpinning vision of the scheme in terms of the outcomes it needs to deliver for people with disability. I met a number of the panelists going back a number of years now. I first met Rhonda Galbally, who several people have referred to, at a conference I was speaking at in TLAP days in Sydney back in 2012, I believe it was, so a very much earlier stage for the scheme, and was absolutely determined at that point that I would find a way to come and work on this at some stage. So it took me a while. But fantastic to have made the change in recent times. Great to catch up with TLAP colleagues. I can't see who's on the webinar, but hopefully some familiar names, in which case very nice to see you again. I'll mention just 3 things really. You'll all be making your own connections with a much closer understanding of the exact context of social care reform in England at the moment, but I'll offer you 3 ideas which I think should have been fairly clear from the fantastic presentations you've been given, but just to reframe them slightly for where we find ourselves in terms of the England situation with social care right now. The first of those is to say, aim high. There really is no point, I think, in not approaching this with a seriously ambitious proposition. It can't be about incremental improvement. It can't be about taking what you've already got and making it just a little bit better. It can't be about papering over the cracks or shoring up the status quo from this point forwards. And it can't be about riding on the coattails of NHS reform, which has so much more of the airplay, I'm sure, still. And I'll give you a couple of specifics in terms of the NDIS aiming high, and you'll have heard this from John and you'll have heard it from others in their presentations, but I think it's worth just thinking about from a UK kind of social care perspective. The first is John's point about the absolute prominence within this scheme of a consumer-driven approach, of a self-directed approach to support, and none of that's new in a UK context, but it's a different approach that's been taken, and I'll draw your attention to the fact that the absolute absence of any aggregate commissioning under the NDIS. There are no block contracts that the NDIA holds with providers. There's been a complete devolution of the funding to individuals. There's a lot about that isn't working yet as it needs to. I think we know that, and I'm in the privileged position of being one of those bastards that Kirsten's now holding it to account for that, and pleased to be so. So there's lots of work we need to do to make that really sort of live up to the promise. But the NDIA doesn't contract with providers. We manage eligibility, we put funding in plans, we review and adjust those plans, we measure and report on outcomes, and we manage the sustainability of the scheme. Which isn't to say, I think, in a UK context that there might not be a really important role for strategic commissioning that is valid as you approach your the next stage of reform, but it can also be a big part of the problem. So I'd encourage you to really think about that. The second, in terms of aiming high, is John's tier 2 of the model. So Australia didn't go into this simply, and I say simply, but to provide a far better experience in an ordinary life for 500,000 Australians with the most significant impairment. From the very get-go, the intention was to make this work and add value and make Australia more inclusive of and for the full 5 million people John referred to that identify as having some form of disability. And that's a huge vision. And again, it's one we've got significant strides still to make in. But I'll give you an example, because this was within my portfolio within the agency until very recently, and we've invested in just the last 18 months over $200 million in disabled people's and families organisations to provide peer support, individual capacity building, self-advocacy, mentoring, other kinds of supports that are absolutely critical out there within the community. And that's user-led organisations by the English parlance that we're talking about, that are run by and for people with disability, and need to have a central role and investment, not just in the campaigning that gets this off the ground, but in the actual delivery of the scheme ongoing. So aim high is my first reflection. My second is to build on the strengths that you've got, because England is different. There are some really important structural differences that might make you listen to those presentations and scratch your head about their applicability within an English context. Some of those might be malleable, they may be, some of them probably aren't, but there are also great strengths in those differences. So in building the English response and reform, you need to identify those and raise them up and really make them into the strengths that they can be. And I'll draw out just two very quickly for you. One is obviously the structural difference between Australia and England in terms of the combined delivery of disability and older people's services within England as social care. We're talking about social care reform in an English context at the moment, whereas in Australia, disability is has been a separately managed thing, both at jurisdictional level and now nationally. And I think there are things about that that conceivably make building the narrative and the grassroots advocacy and the shared leadership around the change harder, but there are also some great benefits. There's a vision that the whole country can get behind, conceivably, with social care. It will genuinely touch everybody's life. So we need to really build on that as a strength, but find ways within that not just to have the broad brush approach, but to really have some focused visions within the vision that people can really get behind, that all connect up to the mothership, if you like, in terms of the reform you're trying to drive within social care. I think it also means you've got to really nurture the mechanisms that exist to create shared endeavour across this major reform. Vehicles like TLAP and the fact that they still exist so many years after their inception are a fantastic indication that there are such vehicles. Social Care Future, I know, is leading a really impactful campaign, and that needs to be given oxygen to breathe. Second is locally devolved versus centrally organised as a structural difference. The NDIS absolutely replaced the fragmented and underfunded jurisdictional systems, and I have to say one of the biggest crash courses for me in moving here is to really continue to grapple with the federal versus state and territory level in sort of politics and the structures that exist. And I know, as was alluded to, I think, by John, perhaps the campaigners didn't envisage a Commonwealth agency being the delivery vehicle for this scheme. So I'm not suggesting that should be the focus in the UK. Think local, act personal. It's there in the name, and that's a great strength in the UK system. The ability of local government, as beleaguered as it is in funding terms, to be able to really stand for place and community and to draw those connections together at a local level. But at the same time, I think that we also need to identify in England the things that don't need to be done 152 different ways, and really find ways to build the national infrastructure to invest in those. And data is the obvious one. I can't really express the level of difference in maturity that exists between the UK and the English system as it relates to social care data and the world-leading longitudinal data set that the NDIS is building, the level of insight that provides, the ability to project forward and manage the system for the best of participants is a world away from where the system is in the UK. And there are other elements of the ecosystem that should be invested in, I think, at national level as well. The research and the evaluation close to my heart at the moment because of the job that I have. Seeding innovation can be done nationally, really supporting approaches that scale up what works, so that we're not doing that 152 different times across the country. And linked to that, my final point really is about investing in demonstrating what works. The NDIS didn't jump from the previous system to the new system in one great leap. There was a trial period. It was across manageable geographies. It enabled the NDIA and the broader community to test what works and to build from that. And the legislation only followed that. The legislation didn't come first. And I think if you look at in the NHS, and I'm sure this is still the case, tripping over demonstration programs with STPs and integrated care systems and the like. And I had the privilege of leading one of those programs in integrated personal commissioning, as Eddie said. But we haven't had that level of investment within social care, and it's warranted. And I think a way of showing how this can work with a really clear, strong vision, with people with social care needs, with a voice and a clear way of evaluating and demonstrating the benefits is a vital step in building the momentum to make the sort of reform in England that's needed that could replicate what's happened with the NDIS. Thanks, Eddie.
Thanks very much, Sam. I think you've added a huge amount of value, sort of trying to interpret the Australian experience to the context in England and the UK. We now have a short 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back. We're going to work through the questions that have been coming in. You've got 5 minutes. If you could be back at 10:30 precisely, we'll get going again. Thank you very much, and please don't leave. Good work, Sam. John.
Fantastic presentations, everybody. Well done. Excellent stuff. Thank you. Someone's making a cup of tea.
So, Carolyn, you think we're about ready to get started again? Hey, Carolyn, can you hear me?
Yeah, let's start.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We've got some fabulous questions that have come through. Some of these are questions in their own right. A couple I'm going to pull together into a bit more of a common sort of question. And those we don't manage to get to during this section, we'll be able to follow up in previous sessions. So just welcome all back. And the first question from Sian Lockwood from Community Catalyst. Hello, Sian. And Sian's question was, could you tell us a bit more about the way in which the provision of individual funding has driven the development of a market that delivers choice of great personalised support? So I'll put that to the panel. Whoever would like to kick off on that one. Bruce, is that something you'd like to do?
Yeah, okay. I'll have the first go at it. I think, look, at this stage, I'd say we've seen, and John alluded to this, less innovation and market development than we might have expected. I think we've certainly seen some development of innovative new platforms for workers to provide personal care and for access to the community. I think in some ways, I think on the supply side, it hasn't been quite as fast as we thought. And I think on the demand side, people have sort of tended to stick a bit more to what they were used to than we thought might be the case. So one of the things that the system provides is it provides support coordination to individuals to assist them with choice, but that market, that the growth in support coordination was not a function that existed prior to the NDIS. And so, again, I would say the development of that and the growth in that market has probably not been quite as fast as we thought. So I guess my response is this is a work in progress, but one we would hope would accelerate, particularly now that the scheme is nationally available.
Great, John, I was wondering if you can come in on this one.
Yeah, Eddie, look, I agree with Bruce. I think it's a work in progress. I think there are windows of great work, great success emerging, and most of those do lie in the market of support coordination. The two areas where I think we need to do a lot more work in that tier 2 capacity building is in building a market of support coordinators and support for decision making that allows people to understand a bit more what their potential options are. And the examples I'm thinking of are where there are a small number of excellent support coordinators who are taking all of the opportunity the NDIS has to offer and making the most of it. I heard a story the other day about, to the extent it's possible in this world of COVID, a party of a group of young men with intellectual disability running it themselves, organising it themselves, purchasing the not the food and drink, which are not something NDIS funds, but the facility and they had an app that had been developed, and they were using NDIS funding to effectively fund a get-together in one of their houses, run by and with and for this young group of people with intellectual disability. And it was just a great story of a situation where prior to the NDIS, they may have had been put to bed in their group homes at 8 o'clock at night or whatever, but here they were having a Friday night party in the same way as any other bunch of young people. So those, and they weren't funding support in so much as they were funding their own potential to achieve a good outcome for themselves in the way that they wanted to.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hey, Sam, I just wonder, you've sort of been involved with, particularly around self-management and more personalised, innovative community living options. Do you want to make any comment?
Well, only to say, I think people are right that the focus within the first few years of the scheme has been on the huge operational challenge of getting 400,000 people into it, which means there's been a bit less focus on what I think needs to be a greater role for the NDIA as an agency on market facilitation and using the fantastic data that we have and using the research that we'll increasingly have to put the right sort of information in the hands of our participants so that they can be empowered by understanding all of the things that are possible under the NDIS, and that's very much where the focus is now shifting. We are seeing some really great examples, Sean. It's great to know you're on the call of different individualized living options is the way we're describing those over here, and that's an umbrella term for describing things like shared lives and home share and other sort of co-residency models that are providing alternatives to more traditional sort of models of housing and support. And I'm looking to some of the great stuff that TLAP's been doing in that regard in the innovation network with Sky as well as a point of reference. In that, there's plenty we can learn actually from the way that innovation has been encouraged and seeded within the UK. So my hope is that we can really start to build on what are some fantastic pockets of wonderful stuff. But the challenge now is really sort of scaling that up and making it something that everybody can expect, rather than the thing that stands out as being the odd thing that isn't what everybody's experiencing necessarily right now.
Great.
I should also add, just Eddie. Sorry, Eddie, if I could just add, there is a startup incubator called Remarkable, and if you're interested in some of the sort of new businesses that have emerged, just Google it, and it specialises in disability startups.
Thanks, Bruce. Hey, just moving on to the next question, which is a combination of questions, partly from Tim Parkin from TLAP and also Gary Bourlet, and it's around the theme of sort of co-production and the involvement of people with a learning or intellectual disability, and also the extent to which materials are available in easy English and plain language and sort of resources that people can more readily understand. So I might just see who'd like to respond to that one. So Kirsten, are you there? You might want to start with this one.
Yeah, so I would think, I would reflect, Eddie, that in the early days of the scheme, I don't think we were very good at that. And I think that we got better as we went along. And I think one of the strengths of the scheme is that we drew on the experience of, there are some fantastic, as Sam called them, user-led organisations out there who really embraced the opportunities that Every Australian Counts provided, the platform, and then ran with it themselves. Some great local groups and organisations who really ran with it. And so I think we got better at it as we went along. I would, and we're still really committed to it. We're doing something in the last couple of days, and we released everything we were doing in Easy Read and had an Easy Read version of it. So we're definitely getting back with it. I would reflect that the agency, again, probably mirrored a little bit of Every Australian Counts. In the early days, were very slow to provide some of their materials in Easy Read and in alternative formats, and Auslan, what we call Auslan, which is our sign language, and are much better at it these days. And so when they release information, it is available in alternative formats so people can go on board. I would say that, you know, and Sam will probably say, that's still very much a work in progress. Sometimes the information that comes out of the NDIS is pretty complicated, and there's been a really strong commitment in the last couple of years to try and make it more simple and plain for everybody, not just for people who have an intellectual disability or a cognitive impairment, but there's still a bit of way to go with that. And that's actually something that we work with, we talk about with the agency a lot, about how that they could make things simpler and easier for people so they were easier to understand.
Eddie, could I just make a comment there as well? Fully agree with Kirsten. One of the other design framework concepts of the scheme within the governance, which I should have mentioned, but just slipped my mind, is a body called the Independent Advisory Council, which is a statutory part of the scheme. It has very powerful, very strong powers under the legislation. And the Independent Advisory Council is meant to provide the voice of the participant to the board in advising the board, and set up by Rhonda Galbally originally, who Kirsten and Bruce both mentioned. And that advisory council has become far more active over the last few years in bringing these sorts of issues to the attention of the agency and the board. So the agency now is very committed to improving the way that it produces fully accessible, easy English materials across the whole spectrum of participants.
Thanks very much, John. I've got just a nice question here from Peter Hay. Thanks, been brilliant. It'd be good to hear what one mistake would the panel not repeat, and also some reflections on the issues for older people. And that sort of also speaks to the issue that Sam raised about social care, younger people with disabilities, older people, you know, the challenges and opportunities of that. So, so I invite panel members to respond to that one. Who'd like to go first?
Oh, look, I'm happy
Probably
to
first
go.
of all, one mistake we don't want to repeat.
Look, I think the mistake that we made was we didn't put enough emphasis on market stewardship from the beginning of the scheme. I think we felt that if we boosted demand, then supply would come, and that demand would become, people would be much more innovative than they've been. And I think one of the things that we underestimated was that it actually takes a lot of time to exercise control and choice. And in a market where the information on the services that you might choose between is not as clear as is needed to make those choices, particularly if you're talking about personal care and those sorts of things. So I think, you know, if I had my time again, we would have put a lot more effort into the market stewardship from the very beginning. And one of the reasons we didn't do that was because the sort of the governance arrangements and who would have responsibility for market stewardship was never clear from the start of the scheme. And so if you're going to rely, if you're going to shift as we have done to such a market-driven reform, you have to put much more effort into market stewardship.
Thanks, Bruce. John, do you want to go next?
Look, I think we should have, and we didn't just because of the pressure to get this rolled out as quickly as possible. We didn't put enough effort into how to build the individual resource allocation model. So how to make sure that every individual, every participant in the scheme received a fair amount of funding, so that we still really have a scheme that is in many ways unfair in terms of how much funding people get. We have a process which we call planning, where people come and talk to an NDIA person and they give them an allocation of funding, but it is pretty subjective still, and it risks being unstable and potentially giving people an unfair amount of money. First of all, we know that those who are more articulate and more able to speak up for themselves, and frankly more wealthy, are still getting a better deal than those who are not, who are socially disadvantaged or in remote or rural areas. So that is a technical challenge, I think, that we didn't do particularly well, and we're just now starting to come to grips with that.
Yep, great. Hey, Kirsten, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think that my reflection is kind of follows on from something that Bruce said. So we've got two groups of people with disability in the scheme: people who had support from previous very fractured and underfunded state systems, and then this group of people who never got support before. And they both have quite different needs in terms of how to navigate through and making the most of the NDIS. And to Bruce's point about kind of, we haven't seen quite the same kind of innovation and change that we would have liked to have seen, is that I think it's because those two groups need quite different things. People who'd had previous experience with systems need some help to A, navigate this new thing that's just dropped kind of in their lap, and then B, they need a bit of a, in our house it's called pushing the reset button. They need to have a bit of an opportunity to think about doing things differently and think about how they, what are their goals? What would they like to do in the future? How could things be different for them? And that's long, slow work to do that. And then on the other side, we've got families like ours, whereas under the previous system, our daughter didn't get any support whatsoever. And so we were completely new. And so we've needed help how to navigate this system. But on the other hand, because we hadn't had any experience with the previous system, we've probably got different ideas about what we'd like to do. So for example, my daughter is just about to leave school. And what we've spent some of her NDIS funding in the last 2 years is a work coach to try and my daughter has Down syndrome, and there are in Australia, there's very historically low levels of people with an intellectual disability in open employment, which is our vision for her. And so we've used a work coach to try and help build her skills and get her ready to leave school and get a job. And that's not something that existed prior to the NDIS. And we've worked with someone who's just a very small business who's now working with a whole bunch of young people in our area on work and social and community participation. And it's awesome. And so I feel that we lost the argument with government. We won the argument for the NDIS, but we lost the argument with government about the additional resourcing that needed to happen to really invest in people with disability and their families to do the kind of really long, slow work that helps them to imagine different futures and makes those happen. And that doesn't take 5 minutes. And in Australia, unfortunately, we've had historically very low levels of funding for user-led organisations and for advocacy and independent information for people with disability. And so we were coming off a pretty low base. And I think we won the argument with the government about the NDIS, but we lost the battle to really invest in people with disability and their families to do things differently. So that's kind of, I would say that that's one of the mistakes I think we made.
Thanks, Kirsten. I might also, Sam, I might bring you in. You've had a good look now. What are some of your reflections?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, firstly, I take some reassurance from the three things that have just been said, being probably one of the three things I would have come out with, and they're things we're working on really hard at the moment. So that's good. I mean, the one analogy you probably hear most about the NDIS, certainly within its first several years, is that we've been building the plane while we're flying it, and that's absolutely the case. And I think we find ourselves now in a position of trying to reverse engineer from quite a complex scheme to something that's a lot simpler, whether that's our planning construct or the way that funding is allocated, through to the way that we work with the market. So yeah, we've got a long way to go, I think, to realise the real sort of vision that those on the call had for this scheme. But I think we're trying to put the right things in place now to do that.
Hey, thanks, Sam. Hey, Bruce, I might come back to you because one of the tensions always was slow and do it, you know, absolutely properly versus all those people that were sort of waiting at the door to come into the scheme that weren't getting anything, and this sort of balance of the two. So do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, very happy to, Eddie. So there was always a tension between wanting to get everybody into the scheme as quickly as possible, because so long as some people were out and some people were in, it was going to be unfair. So, and on the other side, going very, very slowly, making sure that every aspect of the scheme was absolutely as right as we could get it before going to the next stage. One of the complexities of the scheme was that we were starting with very different schemes operating in the different jurisdictions. So we had to actually trial the scheme in all jurisdictions to get a sense of what was the pre-existing system in order to then try and work out how to get to a nationally consistent scheme. And so there's been, I think, just an enormous amount of complexity in the implementation. Look, you know, 7 years in, we've now got 400,000 people out of 500,000. The reason the other 100,000 are not in is because these are often hard to reach groups and these sorts of things. So we're sort of 80% there. I remember a conversation with John where we sort of talked about how long it might take, and I think we've roughly got that right. You know, I think we've roughly got the balance right between trying to implement it as fast as we could, but also give ourselves enough time to sort of reflect and revise and, you know, learn and improve. I think so that would be I think we've roughly got it right. One other point I just wanted to make in terms of things that I think has been a mistake is that in individualising early intervention, we have had a return to a much more medicalised model than family-centred practice than I would have, you know, I guess I'm still shocked that has happened. So people have just taken the money and they wanted to use it for individual therapy. And all the evidence is that family-centred practice is best. So that's an area where we have actually lost something as a result of the introduction of the NDIS. And I know it's on Sam's list of things that he's fixing with in an early childhood, early intervention reset. But, you know, we actually realised that very early on that it wasn't going right. And we've had, I think, at least 3 goes at resetting it, and it's still not reset. So hopefully the 4th go we'll get it right.
Thanks, Bruce. Hey, look, I might just, I'm aware of the time, I might just wind this up a little bit and to say we will try and get to the remaining questions in the next 2 lots of webinars that are coming up. I just also wanted to say, hey, Sam, luckily we got you on board as a chief fixer of all these problems now, so that's not much responsibility. But I think on that note, I just wanted to say personally thank you to an amazing panel, and hand over to Caroline.
Thank you, Eddie. I'm Caroline Speirs. I'm head of Think Local at Personal, and my role essentially is to say thank you to everybody and goodbye. But before I do that, I want to make a couple of reflections, if I may, and perhaps flag an opportunity. We've just heard the most terrific story about genuine transformation and what can be achieved when all parts of the system, and I am of course including citizens as a critical part of the system, agree a vision and then collectively, collaboratively and co-productively deliver the vision. And here in England at the moment, it feels like the key topic of conversation, other than COVID-19, or perhaps in part due to COVID-19, is reforming social care. And it feels like there's significant momentum around this. And I know that many people on this call are committed to a new vision of social care. And there, of course, isn't time to go into detail about that vision, but in a nutshell, I think we're talking about a social care that is sustainable because it receives investment. And then because there's investment, a social care that carries the very real prospect of a return on that investment by contributing to wider economic growth. And most of all, of course, a social care system that really does support people to live as social care future express it, in the place we call home, with the people and the things that we love, in communities where we look out for one another, doing the things that matter to us. I think we all recognise that, and I think we heard how NDIS is achieving this. And a key part of that, it seems to me, in terms of how they've achieved it, is moving social care support from a purely policy framework to an economic and investment framework. And it seems to be working. And I know there are many of us here in England working to support a similar shift, so some really important learning for us here. I was struck too by the development of the Every Australia Counts campaign. And in England, as we all know, the pandemic has raised the public profile of social care. And it really feels like we would be missing a massive trick if we didn't capitalise on that profile by creating our own version of Every Australian Counts. And Kirsten, I noticed in one of your slides, your amazing slides, a slogan that read, "Make it real." Well, here in England, we've got a framework called Making It Real, which is about making good, personalised care a reality, not just rhetoric. And it strikes me that we could potentially use the Making It Real slogan to continue to build on this growing public profile and wrap it around that vision for a sustainable social care model, and do that in the way you described, Kirsten, and in a way I think we're very good at, telling stories, creating space for citizens to tell their stories. So perhaps our homework is to have a discussion with the TLAP partners about how we might take this forward. Certainly isn't time to do it now. I want to thank all of our participants. Thank you for joining this webinar. It was an early start, but I hope you found it helpful and informative, as well as inspiring. I know I did. And of course, it's not over. Please remember to join us for the next webinar on 1st of October at 9 AM. And that session is going to focus on how the NDIS operates in practice. Another date for your diary is going to be the 29th of October, looking at insurance and sustainability principles. And we will send those dates out. But a huge thank you to all of our incredible speakers, to Professor Bruce Bonyhady, to Kirsten Deane, to John Walsh and to Dr. Sam Bennett. Thank you for being so generous in sharing your time and your expertise. Thank you to Clenton and the TLAP team for all your hard work organising all of this, and to James from Sky for your tech support as well. Finally, an utterly massive thank you to Eddie Bartnik, who, through the power of the IIDL, or the International Initiative for Disability Leadership, was able to assemble these amazing speakers, and also did a fantastic amount of the heavy lifting behind the scenes, as well as being an MC extraordinaire today. Thank you so much, Eddie. That's it from me. The recording of today's session will be available on the website shortly. And until we meet again on the 1st of October, have a great day if you're in England, or if you're in Australia, have a fantastic evening. Thank you.
Okay, bye.